All right, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome. This is another fireside chat as part of the Ascent virtual open house. We started this open house a couple weeks ago just to make up for all of the conferences and events that have been canceled due to the global pandemic. And there's a lot of great conversations that happened at those. We wanted to just create a forum, a space where we'd be able to recreate some of those conversations, share ideas, get to know our customers and that kind of thing more. So that was what led to the Ascent Open House. We've been doing a series of fireside chats as part of that. And I'm really excited to have Eser here today to talk about behind all good decisions, how risk and compliance can use data smarter. So Annie, to start, can you just give us a little information about yourself, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I started my career out in big law. I was focused probably the last 7 years of it in SEC and government investigations. I've also moved into public policy really as more of a lobbyist in advocacy, and then have had a lot of experience in both finance and startups and tech, as well as data science over the years.
Awesome. So obviously today we're talking about data, and right now we are very much living in the age of big data, right? Like new technologies have made it possible to collect unimaginable amounts of data on pretty much any subject. So data plays a role in so many parts of our life, but also in regulatory compliance. So I want to just kind of walk through the regulatory compliance timeline and talk about data's role each step of that. Annie, can you start us at the beginning, like before regulation is even formed? How is data playing into public policy that's then playing a role in the creation of that regulation?
Sure. I think we live in an interesting time right now where, because there's so much open source data and we have so much access to data right now, it is leading to a lot more policy that will eventually go into an agency's regulations. And when we look at the trends that are happening, especially as technology improves and as organizations adopt those types of technologies, we are becoming more of a consumer-facing and consumer protection, society, either globally and also domestically. Every industry is really focused on what are best practices, and that really starts with the public policy side and at the legislative side. And so when we're looking at planning, and as we look at the industry topics that are coming up, as we looked about 2 years ago when Dodd-Frank was redone, and we're in a lot of organizations within financial services really starting to plan for that. They were using data within their lobbying shops to be able to start figuring out what did they have to plan for. And so it's aggregating the data of the voting members, looking at the voting history of those members, and ensuring that if these bills had a way to be the likelihood of it passing with the language in that draft, how do you plan for that? And so really it starts way before then. Some of the other things when you're looking at the regulatory scope is focused on, from an industry perspective, if I'm a broker dealer, or if I'm a very specific type of a financial services sector or anywhere else within compliance. It's focusing in on what are the trends that we're seeing, what are the things that regulatory agencies and bodies are actually looking to enforce, and where are they looking to kind of lend more support so that, on the industry side, you're able to plan for that. You can see the trends happening and ensuring that if there's an uptick in enforcement actions on a very specific role, that's being released, how do you plan for that? How do you make sure that your controls are in place and things like that? And it's really just a focus on education.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. So then continuing along with that timeline, once that regulation is getting put in place, how are risk and compliance teams ingesting and analyzing that regulation, all the data that is that regulation? What are some of the challenges that they have there?
I think first and foremost, it's really the aggregation. I think there are multiple channels and a lot of different resources that people subscribe to right now. And I think the number one thing we hear out of either, health care or from financial services or any industry that's heavily regulated is, how do we get access to everything, and how do we make sure that we're following the right people to make sure that we have all the right data so that we are able to put those controls, we're able to follow that regulation as it's supposed to be applied. Some of the other challenges are, because there is so much data coming out, especially in an uncertain environment right now, you see an uptick in protections for industry, protections for consumers during very uncertain times. This is a very uncertain time. What we're seeing right now is this huge number of no action information coming out from regulators, but we're also seeing some items that do have actions that if they're being released, I think there's a statistic out there right now that Ascent uses, which is every 7 minutes there's a new regulatory update. With that in mind, and you put that framework in place, how does one compliance team, either a two-man shop or one of 50, really manage that data, and do we have the right resources? A few years ago, one of the challenges that was faced is that so banking had very specific, federal regulators, state regulators, they follow. One piece of legislation got through an agency from the IRS that everybody missed, because nobody was looking to the IRS for a very specific tax code that they were applying to banks. And so when you think about that, it's really making sure that you are kind of consolidating that information, making sure that people have, the tools in place, but also that human touch where that quality control and that kind of expertise that is institutionalized within organizations is there.
Yeah, definitely. I think the aggregation point is interesting too, because I feel like that's one of the challenges in so many industries that are dealing with data, is that you can collect all of it, but then actually making sense of all of it is so challenging because there's just so much of it. And it's just even more challenging with compliance, because if you miss any of those steps, now you're violating the law. Now you have huge risk that your company's taking on, rather than it just being some missed opportunity or something like that.
Yeah, it's also been manual for so long. I think when you look at even just how attorneys and legal practices, which really stems out of kind of bill review or legal or law review, and you think about how they actually function, the analysis alone takes so many hours. So even if I can aggregate the data for somebody, they still have to make the analysis. Natural language processing and machine learning are, they still have a small margin of error. There is a margin of error. And so there is always going to be that trust in human analysis, and ensuring that domain expertise is applied there, not just automation.
Yeah, in one of our other fireside chats with Spencer, our VP of data science, we were talking about that same kind of thing, right? Where it's when we use the analogy of a self-driving car, if a self-driving car is making a left-hand turn, it needs to be really, really sure that it's going to do that right, because it's really high risk. And if not, you need to have some kind of human expert in there that can help assist with that process. Same thing when you're looking at, regulatory updates. So then to just continue along the process a little more, as firms ingest regulation, they build policies and procedures around those. How do firms then make sure that those policies and procedures are being followed? What kind of ways do they aggregate the data internally to make sure that the controls they've set in place are being implemented?
I think it starts out with the right infrastructure. I think most organizations have a very clear idea of, after they've been operationalized for so long, kind of what they need to do and make sure that everybody plays in the right sandboxes. One of the things that we've seen within technology, especially again with heavily regulated spaces, including healthcare, there are organizations out there that have the tooling to be able to put in place specific controls that your teams or your business line owners are able to stay within. And so we're seeing less violations in those spaces. You can use data to be able to do that within certain aspects of credentialing for members of your teams. If they are only credentialed to do certain things, anytime there is a violation or there are triggers, your system is able to kind of automate who those triggers go to and make sure that there's an action plan in place, so that those errors or those flaws in the system have better controls around them. And so it's really just kind of ensuring that there is the infrastructure built around it to make sure that there's the right technology behind it, and also making sure it aligns with what those policies and procedures are from a manual perspective, and then automating that framework.
Do you think that a lot of firms, banks, when they're automating these same kind of audit procedures, processes, is there the same challenge where these things have been done manually for a long time before, just like with the analysis of regulatory information, and they still have to figure out how to adapt their previous manual processes to something that's somewhat more automated?
Yeah, so I think most industries are catching up to where technology is today to support them, and that learning process and that education of how to apply that in-house is very difficult for a lot of manual processes. It's everything from when we're reviewing bills to being able to figure out, do I have access to this thing? Should I have engaged in this type of transactions? that review, that audit process has always been manual. We do now have this huge industry of fintech and regtech resources at our disposal that kind of help build those controls in place. But it's still an imperfect system if either business lines are operating separately or regional offices are operating separately. And I think one of the things that we see is that across different regions globally, they have different, acceptable practices that don't actually always apply throughout the entire enterprise of an organization. And so that does bring challenges for any organization to have enterprise-wide adoption.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but for enormous companies like that, there would be that difficulty. Then that kind of transitions to my next question for you. So I want to talk a little bit about data privacy, right? Because it's such a big trend happening right now related to data, both like managing of consumer data and how banks are processing the regulation around data privacy. So can you sort of walk us through some of the different regulations out there? I know, the EU and the US have very different versions, and then how firms are handling those regulations.
Sure. So GDPR was released back in 2018, which is obviously a huge deal for the EU. The US does not have a federal law in place right now. And right now, we only have 3 states, Maine, Nevada, and California. California is obviously the most prominent based on Silicon Valley, and a lot of that drives how their policies are now driven. Like they create policies based on the major industries that they operate. And so when we look at that, California is obviously a leader, but when you look at all 50 states, we have, huge challenges within the US on regulation. It's not just with data privacy, it's implementing federal law and asking states to also address those topics individually. And so when you take banking as a whole, it's easier to actually bank in the EU because they have very consistent regulation that applies to all the different countries that are members of the EU. When you look at the United States, we face huge challenges because we have very specific regulation at the federal level. We're not adopting anything at the federal level at this time. It's also very hard to start looking at other states and figuring out, how do they have best practices if this is not something that drives industry in their states. If you look at North Dakota, if you look at, other states that have task force right now deployed, they're looking at this from how do we have best practices for some of the organizations or the industries that we have. But it is not a countrywide adoption at this time. And, I think as people are looking from 2018 forward for the EU, what they're really trying to figure out is the checkbox exercise, or are we really focused on consumer protection? Because that's really what this is about, is how do we protect consumers? Are we doing the right steps? Has it changed anything? And, when you look at data privacy on a global scale, the UN General Assembly, put together this huge organization of, groups of companies that are, raising their hands and saying, we do believe in data protection. This is really what we need to do for consumers. But again, it is, I signed this thing as a company to say that we are going to put best practices forward, but who actually enforces that? And then even with that enforcement action, does it actually hinder companies, or does it make sure that they are doing more than just, we complied with this? Are they taking extra steps?
Yeah, and obviously, the breadth of the GDPR really is more about like, we believe this is the right thing to do and building a system around it. Whereas like you talked about, that fragmented nature that we have in the US, still kind of up in the air, and like how whether it's just a checkbox or not. I can imagine for firms that are operating in both of those regions, it's really challenging to do that. You probably have to just default to GDPR, I would guess.
I think they're going with, they are doing a very regional based, approach. I think most organizations, until they get slapped with either an enforcement action or sometimes some very public display of a breach of data, they are oftentimes just following the exact level of compliance that they have to do. It's very expensive to have compliance teams. It's very expensive to have global enterprise level compliance teams. And so really trying to figure out, regionally, how do they operate within those systems is what you see more often than adopting the most conservative view on compliance.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense from a business perspective. I imagine it's just so tough to implement because there's, such a variety of regulation out there, as you talked about.
Yeah.
So let's look a little bit ahead to the future some. Can you talk about how data can enable things like predictive analysis around public policy, other areas that you see sort of on the forefront of data and firms using it?
Sure. It goes back to the initial conversation is because public policy is really stemmed out of major issues that are coming out of trends in just general consumer behavior or general industry behavior. The more information that people are able to stack together. And so when you look at everything that's open source or everything that is, a bigger picture, you stack it all in one framework, you're able to start looking at behavior so that you can start kind of determining what's going to happen next within certain industries. From a policy perspective, we've known for a long time that just taking data alone, that there was going to be some form of data privacy that was going to be implemented across large regions. It was something that how companies are going to sell it, how companies are going to use it, and how do you protect those consumers. Those were all trends that we were watching happen, and then they came in. When you watch the Jobs Act come in, almost a decade ago, you were watching, investors go into the market who were not accredited, and they were able to invest in organizations. And what protections did we have in place for them? And so we had to roll back some of that and catch up, allow public policy, allow agencies to catch up to protect those investors. And so policies getting put into place once we start seeing a trend of a certain behavior, people jump on different aspects of investment or behaviors, and that's really how public policy is spending a lot of its time, is always playing catch up. And then after that, we see enough of the same problems happen, then we start enforcing things and finding the right agency to actually enforce that.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Okay, so I just want to take a minute here and just open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can also just raise your hand and I can unmute you. While we wait for some of those, I'm going to just share again the link to the open house here. 1 second, I'll drop it in the chat. And we have a few more events coming up on there too. We're talking with Jeff Heine, our CRO, next week about use cases around technology and compliance. I'm excited about that one. And then our CEO, Brian Clark, is going to be speaking with the RegTech Association next week as well. So that'll be another one coming up there that we're excited about too. I'll give it just another minute here, just to see if there's any questions. I'm sure people have an opportunity. All right, great. Well, Annie, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. Hope you and your family keep getting through these strange times that we're in well, and hope the weather stays nice there for you too.
Thanks, Marcus.
All right, thanks everybody. Talk to you later. Bye.